Hi everyone, welcome back to Extra Credit, and this is our 13th episode on ancient Greece. So last time we left off with the Spartans and their allies gearing up to hold the tiny mountain pass of Thermopylae against a Persian army 50 times their size. The Battle of Thermopylae has rightly taken its place in history as one of the great dramas of the ancient world, an example of rock-hard courage in the face of certain death. And like any good drama, it's also got some comic relief in the form of snappy comebacks and witty one-liners. For example, when one of the Persian soldiers boasted that his army's countless arrows would blot out the sun, one of the Spartans fired back, "No problem, we'll fight in the shade." So after 4 days of waiting on pins and needles, the tension finally broke when on the dawn of day 5, Xerxes ordered his troops forward into the pass, with a hail of arrows and a rush of foot soldiers. The first day in one of the most unbalanced contests in the history of warfare had officially begun. Now, as we already saw at Marathon, the combination of heavy armor and team spirit made Greek hoplites a formidable force on the battlefield even when they were mightily outnumbered. But at Thermopylae, another key ingredient was added to the mix, the single-minded resolve of men who knew they were going to die. As the Persians surged forward into the pass, the Greeks leaped out from behind their defensive wall and took up their trademark stance of an unbroken line of shields, punctuated by the bitter points of spears. And as the first wave of the enemy crashed into them, the mountains were soon filled with the chaos of echoing screams and ringing metal. The Allies fought in rotation, with squadrons from each city-state taking a stint on the front line before being relieved by the next force. And although there was no shortage of skill or bravery on either side at Thermopylae, when it came time for the Spartans' turn, Leonidas and his men reminded everybody present why they were the most revered warriors in all of Greece. Or as Herodotus puts it so memorably, at Thermopylae the Spartans fought in a manner that richly merits description. With all the ruthless training of their upbringing leading to this moment, the Spartans showcased a masterclass in utterly disciplined professional combat. Their signature move here was to suddenly turn tail and run as if they had lost their nerve, before whipping around and unleashing a shockwave of damage on the pursuing Persians. And as the day wore on, it quickly became clear that this strategy and the Greek soldiers themselves were doing their job, as the Persians were getting absolutely nowhere. Even the fearsome battalion of Xerxes' best spearmen, known as the Immortals, couldn't turn the tide, with the Greeks' longer spears and thicker armor outclassing the very best the enemy could throw at them. So with nothing but dead comrades and nasty injuries to show for their efforts so far, as the sun set on day 1, the Persian troops limped back to their camp to nurse their wounds and their grudge. But if Xerxes hoped that a new dawn would bring a fresh start, he was sorely disappointed, with day 2 bringing the same fierce Greek resistance as day 1. As each wave of hoplites withdrew behind the defensive wall to be replaced by the next, the piles of Greek dead were dwarfed by the mounds of fallen Persians. But just as Xerxes was getting ready to rip out his last shreds of hair, and yes, the real Xerxes probably did have hair, the greatest gift he could possibly imagine fell right into his lap. Or more accurately, walked right into his camp. This gift was in the form of a man named Ephialtes, a local Greek civilian, whose actions at Thermopylae have officially earned him a place on the naughty list of history. For a small fee, Ephialtes was willing to show the great king something he might find interesting, namely a certain secret path that led around Thermopylae to the Greek camp from behind. In a single stroke, the Allies' doom was sealed. Overjoyed at such a simple cure for his headache, with the coming of nightfall, Xerxes immediately sent his Immortals to follow Ephialtes on the long and winding track around the mountain. Hours later, as the dawn broke on day 3, the Greeks doing their morning stretches were suddenly startled by the cries of watchmen from the ridges above. The Allies had been betrayed, the enemy had been sighted on the pass, the Immortals were coming, and were only hours away. In the stunned silence that followed, King Leonidas looked at the men around him, and in a battle speech worthy of a true Spartan, said simply, "Tonight, we dine in Hades." But there was no need for all 4,000 of them to dine there together just yet. It was now that Leonidas dismissed the rest of the allied troops, sending them back to their fellows in the mainland, where they could live to carry on the fight another day. As for the Spartans, they would stay until the very end, making sure that all the death, and therefore all the glory, belonged to them. As Herodotus puts it, Leonidas knew that by holding his ground he would leave behind him a great name. 2,500 years later, it's safe to say he had no idea just how great that name would be. But lucky for Leonidas, there was no shortage of greatness to go around, because while the rest of their countrymen packed up their weapons and gave a final salute, 700 hoplites from the city-state of Thespiae planted their spears in the ground and refused to budge. After shedding blood in a hopeless struggle side by side for 2 days, the Thespians would make sure that their Spartan comrades wouldn't die alone. So as the sun rose higher and the heat of the day set in, the 1,000 remaining Greeks at Thermopylae suited up one last time. Abandoning the safety of the wall, Leonidas led his men far out into the pass, beyond the narrow space, determined to make the Persians pay dearly for every inch of ground. And when the advancing enemies smashed into the Greek lines, the scene that followed went straight to the history books. With the Persian commanders lashing their troops forward, scores of Xerxes' men were trampled underfoot by their own comrades, or went hurling headlong over the mountain cliff into the sea below, while the Greeks, because they knew they were going to die, fought in a frenzy without regard for their lives. Throwing away their splintered spears, the hoplites pulled out short swords in a chaos of close-up combat, while Leonidas himself fought like a lion among men until he finally fell beneath the crush. Desperate to save their king's body from dishonor, the Spartans surrounded it like wild beasts, until a sudden cry made them turn to see the immortals emerging from the mountain path, pouring down the mountain slopes behind them. With the end only minutes away now, the surviving Spartans and their Thespian comrades retreated to a small hill near their camp, where Herodotus captured their last stand in unforgettable words. On this hill they defended themselves with daggers if they still had them, or else with their fists and teeth. Meanwhile, the barbarians buried them beneath a hail of arrows, pulling down the defensive wall and attacking them head-on, until the final Greek lay dead, and the battlefield was still. In the end, the Battle of Thermopylae was a defeat more magnificent than any victory. As the dust began to clear, an astonished Xerxes made his way through the wreckage, turning to ask one of his followers in awestruck tones, "How many Spartans do we still need to fight? And how many of them are warriors like these?" When the body of Leonidas was pointed out to him, Xerxes vented his rage by having the head impaled on a spear, in revenge for the blood it had cost him to gain these precious few meters of ground. As for the rest of the allies, they were buried where they fell, and in later days Thermopylae became a kind of holy ground for the Greeks, with an inscription reading, "Here is the spot where once 3 million men battled against 4,000 from Greece." Herodotus himself honored the dead by memorizing the names of all 300 Spartans who fought there, and to this day the site is still graced with a monument to the all too often forgotten Thespians, with the figure of Leonidas standing silent guard. But the greatest tribute of all was from Simonides, a poet whose haunting words carved over the battlefield simply read, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obeying their commands, we lie." Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, thanks for watching Extra Credit. Maybe you needed some tissues for today's episode. I mean, I know I certainly got a little bit worked up writing it. This week's pop quiz is how many Thespians stayed behind to die with the Spartans at Thermopylae? Come show me your answer in room 215. As always, work hard, read books, play outside, and we'll see you next time.